Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Toyhouze, and today I'll be comparing Final Fantasy XIV from the perspective of a WoW veteran with 17 years of WoW experience. Since most of you probably play WoW or have played WoW at one point, this video should make more sense to you than a typical Final Fantasy review. Now, Final Fantasy XIV, simply put, is a great game. It's fun, engaging, and it feels a lot like Wrath of the Lich King in many ways, with the group finder, which is called the duty finder in Final Fantasy. In general, it feels a lot more like retail WoW than classic WoW. The party system works very similarly for doing dungeons or trials, even raids. You've got a tank, a healer, and 2 DPS, that's a light party. Threat in FFXIV is called Enmity, which operates the exact same way as Threat. Tanks have abilities that generate more Enmity, or threat, than DPS, so they can hold the enemy's attention. Enmity actually literally means being actively hostile towards something or something, which I thought was kind of cool. It also reminds me, Final Fantasy uses a wide range of words in their game. For example, I thought it was really cool and it kind of stood out. Instead of calling a note a strange note, they called it a queer note. There are a lot more examples of things like this. The writing sort of reminds me of Blizzard's glory days of Warcraft 3, with the Crypt Lord saying things like indubitably as an example, with a big vocabulary. Leveling duties are like queuing up for a random dungeon in WoW, and you get bonus experience and other rewards if you play a role that's in need, like a healer or a tank. This is very similar to Wrath of the Lich King random dungeon, but in Wrath of the Lich King you only queue up for dungeons your level. In WoW, for Final Fantasy, it can be any dungeon at all. Now this keeps low-level dungeons active and finding a group for them quick and easy. Now imagine if you could always find a group for Wailing Caverns or Black Fathom Deeps or even SFK after the game has been out for 13 years. I mean, that's pretty amazing and a genius way to keep these dungeons alive. If you look at World of Warcraft, many servers sort of just progress, and then, once a server has reached a certain point, those dungeons seem impossible to find. Now, one element of this is that you're level synced in Final Fantasy to that dungeon level, so you can't use some of the abilities that you gain from leveling. This might be somewhat annoying if you're max level and you lose the majority of your abilities, but I still think it's cool. The overall effect, I think, is good. Now, in terms of abilities, there are a lot of similarities in abilities. Damage mitigation in the form of self-damage reduction abilities as a tank, similar to Shield Wall, but instead called Rampart, and abilities that reduce enemies' damage in an AoE, so very similar to Demoralizing Shout in the class that I've played. The big difference is that Final Fantasy abilities, in my opinion, are very flashy and can be quite overwhelming at times, especially if you're in a party or a raid. It takes a bit of getting used to all the glow and animations. They're pretty big and can definitely be confusing if if it's your teammates or it's an enemies, you're not really sure. But when you're leveling on your own, this really isn't an issue. You can make sense of your own abilities, and I'm also sure the more you play, the more the abilities make sense. There's also an option in the menu if you want to turn down or even turn off teammates' abilities, so you can sort of not be overwhelmed by that as well. Now, when it comes to a marketplace, the auction house system is replaced in Final Fantasy by a market board, which operates very similarly. The main difference I've noticed is that items just go straight to your inventory or armory chest, which is super convenient. You don't have to go to a mailbox or anything to pick it up. I also noticed in Final Fantasy that you can't die from falling damage. I've tested this from some pretty high up places. The lowest you get down is just to 1 HP. Now I think this is very nice because who likes dying from falling damage? Usually it's just an inconvenience having to go run back to your corpse. Speaking of which, in Final Fantasy there is no running to your corpse, which in my opinion is always just a hassle, especially in Classic where the graveyard is like the opposite side of the map. You gotta go turn on auto walk and then just go AFK. In Final Fantasy, you can either wait to get resurrected by someone or go back to the nearest town from where you died. It's pretty nice. No downtime at all, really. One big difference compared to WoW is how amazingly fast and easy it is to get around. There's no waiting on flight paths, no obscenely long walks. Generally, you can just instant teleport around if you've been to a place before, which is using what's called an aetheryte. You can even use this in major cities to get around, so the long walks you make in WoW, where you're basically semi-AFK, don't really exist that much in this game. I can only recall a few trips early on where I had to do a long walk, which wasn't even that long, and on top of that, every class has a pretty much 20-second long sprint that has about a 60-second cooldown to help you get around faster during those early levels. Right now I'm playing a Paladin on Final Fantasy, and compared to the WoW Classic Paladin, the Final Fantasy one is just 10 times more engaging, probably even more than that. You've got a rotation to go through, tons of abilities to use on cooldown. It just feels like how a class should play. You've got plenty of things you can do. Versus the World of Warcraft auto-attacking Paladin of Classic, where you just cast a seal, basically auto-attack. You will occasionally cast Judgment, but oh no, you don't want to run out of mana. It's really no comparison which one is more engaging and fun. Now, it's pretty crazy because I do have a WoW sub and a Final Fantasy sub right now, which is next level MMO addict mode achieved, and I find myself enjoying Final Fantasy XIV more than World of Warcraft right now, which is crazy to say considering how much I've played WoW and like WoW and truly enjoy the Warcraft lore and all of that. Now, one of the big reasons is that Final Fantasy doesn't really have a lot of these long walks from location to location. This is a damper on my experience. Like in Ashenvale, for example, I'm playing Soul of Iron, I'm on my warrior. There are quests that are literally on the quest giver on the west side of Ashenvale. The quest objective is on the east side of Ashenvale, and you literally have to go do the quest, walk back. It's probably a 15-minute run from East Ashenvale to West Ashenvale. It's absolutely obscene. It's insane. And this is like a quest chain, so you're going to be doing this walk over and over. Now, granted, you don't have to do this quest. You can go find a different one, go find one with a shorter distance, things like that. But WoW Classic has a lot of long walks. It's pretty crazy. Also, not just long walks, but you literally pretty much go AFK when riding on a flight path, whereas in Final Fantasy, you can literally cast a teleport spell. And, honestly, I don't think anyone enjoys those long walks, right? To go grab a new flight path, right? From Menethil Harbor over to, I don't know, South Shore or something like that. I don't know if anyone enjoys those first walks where you're basically AFK, but that's just me. In Final Fantasy, you get a mount pretty early at level 30. You don't have to worry if you can't afford it, honestly. It's just a matter of doing a short quest chain, and you're off moving at a pretty nice speed. Now, honestly, the game just feels very addictive. That is Final Fantasy. Again, sort of like retail, because in my opinion, and this is a pro or a con depending on your what you're looking for, but the difficulty, in my opinion, isn't really there, right? I found that the final boss fight of the original Final Fantasy XIV game was decently hard, and I'm guessing raids in general are probably where you're going to go in Final Fantasy to find a challenge. So if you're looking for an MMO that feels sort of more like a job or is more difficult, I'd say Final Fantasy is not what has given me that feel yet. More Soul of Iron Classic WoW has given me that feel. And a lot of you like Classic and the difficulty that comes with that, right? You like how difficult it is and what a pain it is to do certain things. And, also, of course, depending on your class, right? Certain classes are harder in WoW, but maybe Final Fantasy isn't for you if you're looking for a game that is a little bit more difficult, requires a little more focus, concentration, skill, etc., at least in my experience. Now, one of my absolute favorite things about World of Warcraft are the class quests. I always felt like there weren't enough. I always wanted more. It was the one thing that I felt made you feel unique in the world and it really allowed you to get into your class fantasy. I love class quests. It's amazing. Well, in Final Fantasy, there are a ton of class quests. It's absolutely insane, and it is honestly the most fun part of the game for me. Even the training class quests that you need to go through that teach you how to be a DPS or a healer or a tank were super exciting to me. I just love the dynamic of, this is your unique role that you play. You're important. You have to fit into the group and perform this role. It was a great type of feel. But the least exciting of the class, that was the least exciting of the class quests. They kind of come at you in increments, I've noticed. Sometimes after 10 levels or after 5 levels, you'll get a new class quest, and it's super easy to know it's ready for you because it will literally appear in the top left of your screen. Speaking of which, that brings up the main scenario quests, or MSQ. These quests are the main story or main scenario, and honestly, it's really cool to have some continuity in an MMO. Sort of in WoW, you're just thrown into the world. Granted, chances are you played Warcraft 3 and and you kind of know the story up to this point and can appreciate the world plenty just off of that. But in Final Fantasy, the MSQ makes you feel like literally the most important person around. People applaud you, cheer you on, you're honestly like the soldier of light, you're like super important. It's pretty crazy, and to be honest, it's kind of silly at times, I gotta admit. This is actually my biggest critique of Final Fantasy. It's just a little bit hard to take seriously sometimes. The voice acting, the way characters look, their outfits. Sometimes it just makes me laugh and I'm like, what am I doing? Like the clothing, the general appearance of many characters, the cat ladies, all the anime looking characters, just makes me question like, what the heck is this, right? It's hard to take seriously at times. So if you're a WoW player, you're probably thinking the same thing, but I have to say the gameplay is really, really solid. And I admit I skip the majority of cutscenes in Final Fantasy. There are some that I can't help but watch because they actually got my attention with the story, which honestly the vast majority of games completely fail to do for me. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is my experience with other players. Now, PvP servers seem to be the most popular in World of Warcraft, and I've only recently started playing on a PvE server, and honestly, it has been a great experience so far. That's been my experience with Final Fantasy XIV. I'm not getting ganked by super high-level players at all, and I don't think the game operates that way, which is great. I haven't run into any of that. Now, WoW is notoriously one of the games that has the most possible ways to grief other players, from tagging mobs right before someone else, taking nodes that another player was trying to get, ninja looting, ganking, corpse camping, corrupt loot councils, starting an escort before everyone was ready on purpose, ganking someone trying to do an escort, leaving a group mid-raid or mid-dungeon, getting booted mid-raid or mid-dungeon, or even during a group quest, or maybe tricking someone to flag PvP to gank them, offering someone to enchant their gear, but just taking their materials and logging off. The list just goes on and on and on. There is seemingly an infinite number of ways to grief someone in World of Warcraft. But so far, in Final Fantasy XIV, I haven't encountered any griefing. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm sure I'll see it eventually in some form. It has to exist. But so far, the community has been super helpful. Now, in Final Fantasy, when you're a noob, you have a little sprout next to your name, which basically identifies you as a complete noob. You remember when you were in driver's ed and you had that student driver sticker and everyone completely went around you, cut you off, avoided you because they're like, yeah, I'm not driving anywhere near that noob. Well, the opposite in my experience has been true in Final Fantasy so far for me. I was given advice consistently, invited into a free company, which is the equivalent to a guild in World of Warcraft, and everyone is super positive so far. But I have to say, my recent experience on Shadow Strike in World of Warcraft Classic, Season of Mastery, the PvE server, has been very similar. I'm in a very friendly, helpful guild, and there seems to be a great community there, from my measurement anyway. But I have seen the dark side of World of Warcraft in all of its horror. I'm sure you have too. Now, gear score exists in Final Fantasy, and it's very similar to item level in WoW, where you can't queue up for certain encounters or dungeons, etc. if you do not have high enough gear or good enough gear. So far, I'm level 55 in Final Fantasy XIV, and the max is level 90, so I'm about a tenth of the way into the game. You know the saying, when you're level 30 in WoW, you're not halfway to 60, you're about a quarter of the way to 60, since those last levels take so long. Now, in Final Fantasy XIV's case, I can definitely feel the experience diminishing returns, and my leveling is slowing down for sure, but that is definitely normal for an MMO, and I'm assuming the back half towards level 90 will take some serious time. So you might be wondering, should you try Final Fantasy XIV? Honestly, MMOs are social games. If you have friends, I know I don't, but if I did, and if you do, which, let's be honest with ourselves here, just kidding. If your internet friends are playing Final Fantasy XIV, then it makes sense to play it with them, in my opinion. If you're like me and care more about gameplay than the fact that there are a ton of anime-looking characters running around, then maybe Final Fantasy XIV is for you. But if you can't look past all the cute cat girls and admittedly good-looking men, anime men, then maybe Final Fantasy XIV isn't for you. The game has definitely made me question, if I had to choose WoW or Final Fantasy XIV, which one would I play? And it's a really hard choice. WoW literally feels like home, but there are a lot of reasons to let WoW go. Final Fantasy has been a really fun, new adventure with amazing looking monsters to fight and kill and beautiful environments. I mean, both are amazing games. So I'm going to be playing both. That's all for my review. Have you played Final Fantasy XIV? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit me up with a like and a sub if you enjoyed the video. Thanks, and take care.